Imagine a world where the sky had no borders and one blue globe ruled them all. But behind the white gloves and caviar lay a trail of secret deals, Cold War espionage, and a final, shattering explosion. The year is 1991. On a cold December morning, a blue and white Boeing 727 pulls onto the tarmac in Miami. To the casual observer, it's just another flight. But as the engines wind down for the last time, the crew doesn't reach for their bags. They embrace. They weep. This was Flight 436, the final heartbeat of Pan American World Airways. For over 6 decades, Pan Am wasn't just an airline, it was the unofficial flagship of the United States. It was the company that taught the world how to fly, bridging oceans that were once thought impassable. It turned pilots into captains and flight attendants into icons of grace. Yet today, the Blue Globe is a relic of history. How did the most powerful aviation empire in human history vanish into thin air? To understand the tragedy, we have to go back to the beginning, to a man with a vision as vast as the Pacific itself. In 1927, aviation was a sport for daredevils and madmen. Most people wouldn't dream of crossing a state line in a flying machine, let alone an ocean. Enter Juan Terry Tripp. Tripp was a Yale graduate with a relentless, almost predatory ambition. He didn't just want to start a mail service, he wanted to conquer the map. His first move was a masterstroke of diplomacy and grit. In October 1927, with a tiny Fokker F-7, Pan Am flew the first scheduled international flight from Key West, Florida to Havana, Cuba. It was only 90 miles, but it was the spark that would ignite a global revolution. Tripp's genius wasn't just in planes, it was in politics. He convinced the U.S. government that Pan Am should be its chosen instrument for international mail. While other airlines fought over domestic routes in the Midwest, Tripp was busy dining with presidents and dictators, securing exclusive landing rights that created a virtual monopoly on the world. By the 1930s, Pan Am realized that if they wanted to cross the Atlantic and Pacific, they couldn't rely on traditional runways, because in many parts of the world, they didn't exist. The solution? The flying boat. This was the birth of the Clipper. Names like the China Clipper and the Philippine Clipper became legendary. These were massive 4-engine Sikorsky and Boeing flying boats that landed on the water like elegant swans. Inside, the experience was more Titanic than economy class. Passengers sat in plush armchairs, ate 7-course meals served on fine china, and retired to sleeping berths with real linens. Pan Am wasn't selling transportation, they were selling the dream of the jet set before the jet even existed. The crossing of the Pacific in 1935 was the 1930s equivalent of the moon landing. It took 6 days in multiple stops, Honolulu, Midway, Wake Island, Guam, but it changed the psyche of the planet. The world was shrinking, and Pan Am held the tape measure. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941, the glamorous Clippers were painted matte gray and drafted into service. Pan Am became the secret weapon of the Allied forces. Their pilots, who knew the global routes better than any military navigator, flew FDR to the Casablanca Conference and ferried vital supplies across the hump in the Himalayas. But the war changed aviation forever. It left behind thousands of miles of paved runways across the globe. The age of the flying boat was over. The age of the land-based propliner had begun. If the 1930s were about adventure, the 1950s were about power. In 1958, Juan Tripp made the biggest gamble in corporate history. He ordered 45 jet aircraft from Boeing and Douglas, the 707 and the DC-8. At the time, people thought he was insane. The 707 was twice as fast as the fastest propeller planes and carried twice as many people. On October 26, 1958, Pan Am's Clipper America flew from New York to Paris. The flight took less than 9 hours. Suddenly, Europe was a day trip. This was the zenith. The Pan Am building, now the MetLife building in New York City, rose over Grand Central Terminal, a literal monument to Tripp's ego. Every world leader, every Hollywood star, and every business mogul flew Pan Am. To wear the wings of a Pan Am pilot was to be a god of the airways. But as the 1960s drew to a close, the very thing that made Pan Am great, its massive scale and its pioneering spirit, would become its greatest liability.
The high-altitude gamble. By the mid-1960s, one Tripp was the most powerful man in aviation, but he was restless. The Boeing 707 had changed the world, but it was already becoming too small for his vision of mass global travel. In 1965, during a fishing trip with Bill Allen, the president of Boeing, Tripp made a proposition that would change the silhouette of the sky forever. He told Allen, "If you build it, I'll buy it." Allen replied, "If you buy it, I'll build it." The "it" was the Boeing 747, the jumbo jet. At the time, the 747 was a terrifying engineering challenge. It was so large that Boeing had to build the world's largest building just to assemble it. For Pan Am, it was a $525 million gamble, a staggering sum in 1966. Tripp envisioned a ship of the skies, with 2 decks, a spiral staircase, and a lounge that felt like a high-end social club. On January 22, 1970, the Clipper Victor made the first commercial 747 flight from New York to London. It was a triumph of American ingenuity. But behind the champagne toasts, a perfect storm was brewing. Pan Am had doubled down on massive capacity, just as the world was about to run out of fuel. In October 1973, the OPEC oil embargo struck. Fuel prices didn't just rise, they quadrupled. For an airline like Pan Am, which operated a fleet of fuel-thirsty 747s on long-haul international routes, this was a death knell. The 747s were flying half-empty. The queen of the skies had become a white elephant. While domestic carriers in the U.S. could lean on shorter, more efficient routes, Pan Am was legally restricted from flying between U.S. cities. You could fly Pan Am from New York to London, but you couldn't fly them from New York to Los Angeles. This was the chosen instrument trap. The U.S. government had used Pan Am as its unofficial flag carrier for decades, but they refused to grant them domestic feed routes. Passengers would fly a domestic airline to a coastal gateway, then switch to Pan Am. When the domestic airlines started launching their own international flights, Pan Am had no way to compete for those local passengers. The giant was being starved of its lifeblood. In 1968, shortly before the 747 took flight, Juan Tripp retired. For 40 years, Pan Am had been a one-man show. Tripp ran the airline like a private fiefdom, making decisions based on intuition and political maneuvering. When he left a vacuum. The leadership that followed lacked his ruthless diplomatic touch. They were managers, not visionaries. They inherited a company with massive debt, an aging workforce with powerful unions, and a corporate culture that was arguably too proud to admit it was failing. The Pan Am staff still walked with the swagger of the 1950s, even as the bank accounts were draining. If the oil crisis was a wound, the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 was the salt. Before 1978, the U.S. government controlled where airlines flew and how much they charged. It was a stable, protected environment. Deregulation changed everything. Suddenly, anyone with a few planes could start an airline and undercut the giants. Low-cost carriers began popping up, and established domestic giants like United and American started aggressively expanding into Pan Am's sacred international territory. Pan Am was paralyzed. They had the highest overhead costs in the industry. Their blue ribbon service was expensive to maintain. To survive, they finally did what they should have done a decade earlier. They bought a domestic airline. In 1980, Pan Am acquired National Airlines for $437 million. On paper, it was the perfect marriage.
National's domestic network feeding Pan Am's international routes. In reality, it was a disaster. The corporate cultures clashed, the fleets were incompatible, and Pan Am paid far too much for an airline that didn't solve their fundamental problem. They were bleeding cash at a rate of millions of dollars a day. By the early 1980s, the world's most experienced airline was in survival mode. To keep the lights on, they began a tragic fire sale of their history. First went the iconic Pan Am building in Manhattan, sold to Metropolitan Life for $400 million. Then came the ultimate betrayal of Tripp's legacy, the sale of the entire Pacific Division to United Airlines in 1985. The routes that the China Clipper pioneered in the 1930s, the very soul of Pan Am, were sold for $750 million. Pan Am was essentially cannibalizing itself to stay airborne. The blue globe was shrinking, retreating to the Atlantic and South America, hoping for a miracle that would never come.
The final descent. By the late 1980s, Pan Am was a shadow of its former self, but it still carried a prestige that made it a target. In the eyes of the world, Pan Am was America, and in the volatile landscape of 1980s geopolitics, that made it a lightning rod for terror. December 21, 1988, 4 days before Christmas, Pan Am Flight 103, a Boeing 747 named Clipper Maid of the Seas, was cruising at 31,000 feet over the quiet town of Lockerbie, Scotland. It was a full house, 243 passengers and 16 crew members, many of them students heading home for the holidays. At 7:03 p.m., a timer triggered a small amount of plastic explosive hidden inside a radio cassette player in a cargo container. The blast punched a hole in the fuselage. In seconds, the Queen of the Skies disintegrated. All 259 people on board and 11 on the ground were killed. The Lockerbie bombing wasn't just a human tragedy. It was the final, fatal blow to Pan Am's reputation. Investigations reveal the shocking lapse in security protocols. Travelers who once saw the blue globe as a symbol of safety and luxury now saw it as a liability. Bookings plummeted overnight. People were terrified to fly the American flagship. Pan Am was already bleeding cash. Now it was hemorrhaging its soul. If Lockerbie was the wound that wouldn't heal, the 1990 Gulf War was the infection that turned gangrenous. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, jet fuel prices skyrocketed once again. International travel slowed to a crawl as the world braced for a global conflict. For Pan Am, which relied almost entirely on transatlantic traffic, there was nowhere to hide. The airline filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in January 1991. They hoped to restructure, to find a partner, to somehow survive as a smaller, boutique carrier. Delta Airlines stepped in, buying the profitable North Atlantic routes in the iconic Pan Am shuttle in the Northeast U.S. for $416 million. Delta was the lifeline. They promised to inject cash to keep a new Pan Am alive, focusing on South American routes from a hub in Miami. For a few months, it looked like the blue globe might keep spinning, albeit on a much smaller axis. The new Pan Am lasted less than a year. By December 1991, the losses were too great. Delta Airlines, facing its own economic pressures, pulled the plug. They stopped the funding. On the morning of December 4, 1991, CEO Russell Ray Jr. had to make the call no one wanted to hear. The airline was out of money. Not low on money, literally out.
At 9 a.m., the word went out across the system. Shut it down. Flight 436 from Bridgetown, Barbados touched down in Miami. It was the last one. As the captain taxied to the gate, fire trucks lined the runway, spraying a water cannon salute. It wasn't just the end of a company, it was the funeral of a culture. Over 9,000 employees were out of work instantly. Many found out from the news. Some were mid-flight when they heard their company no longer existed. They landed, parked their planes, and walked away from a lifetime of service. To get those 30,000 views, we have to answer the why for the audience. Why did the world's greatest airline fail while others survived? The monopoly trap. Pan Am was built on exclusive government favors. When deregulation happened, they didn't know how to compete in a street fight for passengers. The lack of a domestic network. You cannot run an international airline without a way to get people to the international gate. Pan Am was a bridge with no roads leading to it. The 747 paradox. The plane that made them famous also broke them. They bought too many, too early, right before fuel prices made them impossible to fill. Arrogance. Pan Am's management believed they were too big to fail. They maintained luxury standards and high salaries long after the math stopped making sense. Today, you can still see the Pan Am logo on t-shirts, bags, and in movies. Why does a dead airline still have so much brand power? Because Pan Am represented the optimism of the 20th century. It represented a time when travel was an event, when the world felt like a place to be explored rather than a series of security checkpoints. They gave us the flight attendant's uniform, the cabin pressure systems we use today, and the very concept of the global citizen. Juan Trippe didn't just build an airline, he built a world. And though the planes are in boneyards and the uniforms are in museums, every time you board a jet and cross an ocean in a few hours, you are flying in the wake of the blue globe. Pan Am didn't just fall, it was pushed by history, economics, and tragedy. But for those who flew the Clippers, the sky will always be a little bit bluer. If you enjoyed this deep dive into aviation history, hit the like button, subscribe for our next documentary on the corporate giants that changed the world.